Let's go over the difference between relative and absolute cell references in Excel. These are very fundamental to being able to use Excel effectively and efficiently, and knowing the difference between these and when to use each will make your life a lot easier in Excel, and it will make your spreadsheets much more flexible. So in this example, I have some projected sales that I want to calculate for 2021. So we have our sales from 2020, and we want to calculate an increase, and it's a different increase for each month. So we want to calculate the increase and what our total amount of projected sales would be for 2021 based on those numbers. So we have our sales amount, the percent of increase that we will calculate for each month. In column E, what we'll do is calculate just the amount of the increase first, and then in column F, we will calculate the total amount that we've projected for our sales for 2021 for each month. So you could do this in one step, but I'm going to do it in 2 steps just to give us a little bit of practice. So in the amount of the increase, we just want to calculate the sales amount here and multiply that by the percent of increase. So we always start with an equal sign, and then I like to click on each cell reference rather than typing it in, and you'll see that it color codes the cell references as well. So I'm going to use the asterisk for the multiplication and then multiply it by the increase. Okay, notice that's C6 times D6. I'm going to press enter, and I could go in and create a formula that said C6 times 0.05, and then if I did that, I would have to change that number manually all the way down the column. So when you create a spreadsheet like this, use the cell references, and it will make it much more flexible for you, because if I ever went in and decided to change any of these numbers, it will automatically be reflected in the formula, and if I've used the cell references, I don't have to go back in and change anything there in the formula, just over here in the column where it's easier to do. Okay, so we don't hard code those numbers in if it's something like this. So we can copy this formula down the column and let Excel do the work for us. So I'm going to use that fill handle here, where it gives you that little plus sign in the bottom right corner. And you can double click or you can drag it like I just did. So it gives you all of the numbers for the amount of increase for each month. So what it's done, let's look at what Excel did when it copied those formulas down. It's originated as C6 times D6. And then when we copied it down from one row to the next, now it's C7 times D7 in row 7. And you'll notice as you click in your cells, it has changed the row reference, okay? So it's only changing the number, which is the row reference. And that's because we copied the formula from one row to the next, okay? So if I were to go here and copy this from one column to the next, and in this case it doesn't make sense logically to do that, but I'm going to do it just so that you can see what the cell references will do in the formula. So if I copied it from one column to the next column, if I click over here, now you can see that it's done something differently. It has changed it from C6 to D6, and each column has moved over 1 in the way it's referenced. Now it's D6 times E6. The row number did not change. The reason for this is because I copied it from one column to the next. So the column letters changed. So here I copied it from one row to the next, so only the row numbers changed. So this is why we call these relative references. C6 is a relative reference and D6 is a relative reference. And that's because as I copied that formula down from one row to the next, it changed relative to how I copied it. As I copied it from one column to the next, it changed relative to how I copied it and only changed the columns. Okay, so let's calculate the reference in F, or the formula in F. And this time what we're going to do is this is just the amount of the increase, right? It's not the total projected sales amount. It's just the amount we expect it to increase based on this percent. So what we need to do now is take the sales amount and add what we expect to increase here. If we add those together, that should give us our total projected amount for 2021. So we hope that our sales will increase by that amount in 2021. And you can copy that down the column. And as we copied it from one row to the next, you can see again the cell references changed. And in this case, it only changed each row number. Okay, again, those are relative cell references. Okay, so let's look at our absolute references. So again, let's look at how we did this in a relative cell reference. We took the sales amount and then we added the sales amount times the percent of increase. Okay, so that's technically what we did before. We just did it in 2 steps. Okay, so there are several different ways you can do that. I'm just doing it a fairly common way. So if we copied this down, and you can see the first number is 36,634. So you can see that it's the same amount as it was here. So I'm going to copy that down the column. And again, those are all relative cell references. Each of these is a relative cell reference, and it has changed for each row. Okay. So in this case, I changed all of the percentages to just a 5% straight across the board increase. Okay, instead of having different increases for each month as we did previously. So if we have this 5% increase, there's no need to really have a separate column for it. Okay, so really we could not include that column, and we could include somewhere on our spreadsheet a cell that has the 5% in it that says that this is the percent of the increase we are working with. Okay, so we'll do the calculation the same way, but in this case we're going to use an absolute reference. Okay, first I'm going to show you how it works with the relative reference, and then I'll show you how we'll need to change it to use an absolute reference. Okay, so we'll start with that equal sign. It's going to be the sales amount, and we're going to multiply that by the increase. So remember, that gives us the amount of the increase. Okay, and then we can add that back to the sales amount. Okay, so that's one way that we can do it. And there are multiple ways. You could add the 1 plus the 5% and do it another calculation, but we're going to stick with this way. So again, this is adding the percent and then adding the amount of the sales back to the amount of the increase. Okay, so let me say that again. I think I said that a little differently. So we're going to take the sales times the percent of increase. This gives us the amount of the increase. Okay, and then we're going to add that back to the sales amount, so it gives us our total projected amount. Okay, so I'm going to copy this down, and you can see it gives us the same number. Okay, that's what we did with the relative. But the key is when we copy that down the column. Ooh, and you can see we have some errors. And this is a very large number. I'm just doing a logic check. And this one is the same as the amount of sales, which is not correct. So if you do a logic check and just look at some of those cells, you know these are not correct. So as we look, first thing to do is look at the second cell and see how it copied it. So it took C8, which is the amount of the cell, which is correct, times B5. Okay, well, there's nothing in B5, so that's why we got 0 for the amount of increase, and that's why that's the same number as this, okay? And then I added it back to C8, which that is correct, okay? But the problem is it's changed this to B5. So in this one, it's C9, which is correct. That's the cells for each month for March. And it's multiplied it by B6. Well, B6 is 2020. It's the year. So that is not correct. It needs to be multiplying it by this same cell, B4. So then it's adding it back to C9, which is correct. So the problem we have here, and you can see the value, the reason it's giving you the value error is it's C10, and in C10, we have our cells times B7. Well, in B7, it says January, so you can't multiply by text. So that's why you're getting these errors, okay? So the problem is, as it copied it down from one row to the next, it did, just as it always does with relative cell references, it changed the row number as it copied it down, which is fine for the C8 here and the C8 here, because we want those to change for each month. However, we don't want it to change for this one. We want it to always be B4. All of these need to multiply by B4. But unfortunately, that's a relative cell reference, and it's changing the row as you copy it down. So what you need to do is go in, and I'm going to go to the first formula and make it correct so that I can copy it down the rest of the row. So in that first formula, we want to change B4 and make sure that as we copy it down, it stays the same as we copy that formula down. So B4 needs to be what we call an absolute cell reference. And absolute means there's a $sign before the column and before the row, okay? That means that the B will not change and the 4 will not change. So you can type those in individually, or you can use the F4 button on your keyboard. You might have to use function F4 depending on your laptop. But if you press the F4 on your keyboard, it will add those $signs. If you accidentally keep pressing the F4, it will toggle through what we call mixed references. But anything that has a $sign before it means that that will not change. Okay? So we're going to use a pure absolute cell reference for this. Okay? Even though we're just copying from one row to the next, we want the $sign before the column and the row. Okay? So once you've done that, press enter, copy that formula down again. Now these look like a logical set of numbers for what we've done. So then you can go in and just click on a few of those cell references to see what it's done. It's keeping the B4 the same, so that all of the cells amounts are multiplied by this 5% in B4. So then if I wanted to say, okay, well, maybe we don't want that much of an increase. We just want 3%. If I press enter, you can see that it then recalculates everything at 3%. So I could play around with my numbers and do a little bit of a what-if analysis that way. Okay, so this, when you set out the percent in a separate cell like that, generally if it's outside of the data, kind of by itself, you would use an absolute reference. Okay, so relative references change relative to how you copy the references in the formula. Absolute references stay the same. So I hope that clarifies the difference between relative and absolute references. Play around with those numbers, and when you copy your formulas in an Excel spreadsheet, just click around and see what it's doing when it copies the formulas down the column or across the row.